welcome to our panel on HP Lovecraft and his writings and his influence and the connections that go all the way down to A Song of Ice and Fire in very obvious ways and in some non-obvious ways as well. So I'm Silas Toms. This is my first convention ever. I'm having a blast. Thank you all for having me.
Yeah.
And I didn't just want to come and just lurk. I wanted to come and share something that I've been thinking about for the last few years. I got into the fandom right after the second season, like most of you guys, and started lurking on Reddit for like 2 years and really read up on all the theories and started seeing references to Lovecraft and his contemporaries. And I didn't really know what it was about. I didn't even know it was a guy for a while. I thought it was some mystical thing, Lovecraft, you know. And so I started reading up on it and really got into it and found that, like, not only is it, you know, an influence and is George paying homage to it, he is really borrowing a lot of the characters and places and themes.
Absolutely. My name's Emmett Booth. I go by Poor Quentin on Tumblr and Twitter. I do a podcast called Not a Cast with Brendan Beefish, aka Jeff Hartline. I've always been a huge fan of Lovecraft and cosmic horror and weird fiction in general, and something that drew me to A Song of Ice and Fire right away was the clear presence of kind of those themes and images in there. And I mean, something we're going to talk about here is how what makes Lovecraftian fiction unique is how it's expanded well beyond the author and did so immediately, and had you can see the early roots of fandom, the early roots of an aesthetic extending beyond the author to an entire brand across multiple kinds of storytelling, and that's something we find really fascinating, and it's really come to root in A Song of Ice and Fire in a lot of fascinating ways. So, the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown.
Well put. You've got our contact info up there as needed. So who was Lovecraft? He was born in kind of a wealthy family in the Northeast, near Boston, or actually Rhode Island.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and his dad died when he was about 3 and was put into an insane asylum, probably because of syphilis. And they never really acknowledged it, but that was relatively common at the time. And he was kind of ignored by his mother and his aunts, who he lived with after the father passed away. And so he just read a lot. And he was very literary and very smart, but also kind of, you know, maybe a little bit dark. And apparently he had a lifelong fear of seafood. He did not like octopi or lobsters or any of the normal stuff that people would eat up in that area.
Yeah, it reminded me of the Jim Gaffigan joke about how everyone in New England loves eating seafood, but it's bugs. They're just bugs. It's just lobsters or creepy crawly bugs that went across the bottom of the ocean floor. And I mean, I think that's so indicative of the kind of stories Lovecraft would write, that he would see these kind of creatures that are treated as mundane, but still kind of have this wildness and fascination about them, as a lot of sea creatures do, even the ones we eat. Have this strangeness to them that doesn't really go away, and I think you can kind of see the roots of the stories he would write in that.
So, yeah, as I mentioned, his father died in a sanitarium, and then later, maybe 20 years later, his mother ended up dying in the same sanitarium or asylum. So he was kind of just surrounded by madness and consumed by it in some ways. You know, throughout his life, he also had a failed marriage that had him move to New York City, where he just was kind of freaked out by New York City, just the amount of people that there were from different lands, and he was kind of a shut-in as a personality, and it kind of scared him. The world kind of scared him.
Yeah, you can constantly see in his writing a struggle to find an answer. There's this question that seems to dominate him, and he's trying to define over the course of his work, which is, why is the life that's supposed to make me happy and brisk and modern just terrifying me? And of course, as we'll get into later, some of that was his truly heinous ideological beliefs about the people around him. But it also perfectly captures an era in which a lot of things were changing in that particular part of the country. And I think few came up with a more kind of intense, philosophical and imagery-driven reaction to that than Lovecraft. And he really was a man of his time in that ways. And in ways that are both reprehensible but also really revealing, I think.
So as I mentioned, he read a lot as a child, and some of his biggest influences were Mencken, James, Chambers, Poe, Lord Dunsey, Blackwood, and he borrowed a lot of their themes and also directly took their characters and used them within his story. It was just kind of relatively common at the time, I would say, or at least there wasn't as much like a internet mob out to stop you from borrowing someone else's ideas.
Copyright didn't exist then.
There you go, exactly. And so his first stories reflected a lot of his influences, and you could almost connect what he was reading at the time to the output.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think this is, you could argue, this is the birth of what we call genre fiction now, is authors like Poe and the influence they had on Lovecraft and how they related to each other and the kind of tropes and images they were using. I mean, this is where you start to get the birth of the novel and other written forms as something different than the purely high art form. You get a sense of it where it could start to become a popular art. I mean, it's kind of this weird contradiction we're going to tease out as we go, that Lovecraft was such a withdrawn man who hated society and hated the people around him, but his work has had such a massive influence on popular art across every single medium you care to name. And part of that, I think, is he was tapping into something that those influences were drawing from too, the sense of a different kind of popular fiction. There's that great Tolkien quote where he was like responding to a fan letter right after Lord of the Rings started selling super well, and he said, I'm so pleased to know that what I thought was true was correct, that there's a huge adult audience for the so-called fairy tales. That's not just something to read to your kids when you go to sleep, it's something that adults want to read. And Lovecraft is a huge part of that.
And he was also incredibly interested in sciences as they were developing at the time. There was a lot of new planets being discovered, like Saturn and Pluto, and there was also a lot of theories. They hadn't really come up with plate tectonics at the time, so they were theorizing lost continents, especially Lemuria, because they noticed that there was lemurs in India and lemurs in Madagascar, and they thought, well, how did they get from there to there? Not understanding continental drift and whatnot, so they imagined that there was a giant continent that had just sunk one day. And as that idea was sort of put aside, they said, well, maybe it was out in the Pacific, kind of, this idea of Atlantis or of Mu, of Thule, this long-lost civilization that was more advanced and was suddenly destroyed, leaving humans in a barbarous state. It appears again and again throughout his output.
Yeah, it's really, again, representative of the era. I mean, it's this strange mix of, we start getting these huge scientific advancements, but the worldview we were bringing to them, at least in Western countries, was still very kind of born in the era when we would draw maps and say here there would be dragons at the end and we didn't know what was there. So it was this interesting mix of science and fear of the unknown that really produced a lot of Lovecraft's worldview and his fiction. And yeah, I mean, it was an era in which we were learning more and more, but the worldview we were bringing to the information just made us more and more afraid. We were, we were investing in the fruits of the Industrial Revolution, but we were still bringing this mindset to it that felt like we were meddling in affairs we shouldn't. And that combination of a thrill in human achievement and a fear of what it could bring, a fear of what it's going to bring us up against, is so present in Lovecraft's fiction. It's a theme over and over again in his stories that we're gonna stride out confidently into the unknown, into space, into the sea, and what we're gonna find is gonna remind us of how small we are and how little we know. And that's so. I think you could not possibly come up with that particular worldview in any other era than the era kind of that birthed Lovecraft.
Yeah, because it was an era of knowledge expansion, and yet there were darkness around each piece of knowledge that was gathered.
Exactly.
And it was ancient ideas of these, Atlantis, that were still sort of being circulated and still being put to rest, in essence. And that's only 100 years ago, which is kind of amazing.
Yeah, that's true.
So he started writing throughout the 19-teens, but he first got published around 1920, and he wasn't as successful with his own writings at the time, but he was ghostwriting a lot for a lot of different people, including Charlie Chaplin even, I found out, among many others. He was well known behind the scenes, and while he had his own stories, he was kind of afraid to push them. unfortunately, because of his shut-in nature.
Yeah, certainly true. I mean, it's the eternal contradiction that his withdrawn nature kind of helped inspire the kind of dread that drives his fiction, but at the same time that prevented him from getting a lot of recognition as an artist, especially within his own time. But yeah, I mean, you know, when you see him start getting published in magazines and kind of this kind of cult context again, this is the kind of ferment that created genre fiction as we know it now. This kind of serialization and this focus on short stories and on, you know, kind of producing this steady stream of content through which you shape your aesthetic. That's a lot of how authors like George R.R. Martin developed. That's a lot of great authors and a lot of great filmmakers developed in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And Lovecraft was really a couple generations ahead of his time in terms of how he developed as an artist and what moved him. It wasn't, you know, salon or patronage based. It wasn't the three texts he revered that he tried to copy. It was this weird stew and synthesis of influences he was working out in public over time. It was, you know, like Dickens in the gutter, like, you know, taking that kind of intense serialization and focus on developing aesthetic, but with content of monsters and strangeness and adventure stories. It was like the Victorian adventure stories gradually became what we now call genre fiction. And Lovecraft is a huge part. Exactly, and Lovecraft is a huge part of that.
And the people who did get these few stories of his became huge fans of his, and they started writing to him. So he developed relationships through the pen, in essence, with, I'd say hundreds, but probably at least 10 to 20 real serious fans who became very famous writers in their own right. And he wrote literally thousands of letters. There's whole books collecting his correspondences that show a much deeper side, and that's where we know so much about Lovecraft himself, actually, and a lot about these writers who he was friends with.
Yeah, again, it's a model for how a lot of genre fiction developed and works today. This intense connection between authors and the audience, in the sense of a community developing between the two of them, the sense of a genre building around that idea. That's you know, the ideas behind that is why we have a convention about A Song of Ice and Fire, and a lot of that was developed in the early 20th century around the work of writers like Lovecraft.
So some of those friends and contemporaries I've listed on the flyer, if you haven't grabbed one, they're up here, but you know, to name a few, Robert Bloch ended up writing Psycho in the 60s. Robert E. Howard developed Conan, that you've heard of, a few other, you know, he was the father of sword and sorcery in essence. And there was many other people who have been famous at their time and are less famous now, but these guys were literary giants in some ways, and he kind of was the puppet master behind it all, in essence.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember there's this quote from it might be apocryphal. It's supposed to be from Brian Eno, that only 100 or so people bought the first few Velvet Underground records, but everyone who bought one started a band. So you have this influence that may outstrip your initial commercial success. I mean, Brian Eno himself is a great example of that. He's a dude who, you know, started out as a huge pop star and developed this intense relationship with a few arty fans, and started collaborating them with David Bowie and with Iggy Pop and a lot of crazy German artists. And you know, Lovecraft is a really strong starting point for a lot of people who work like that. For you develop a community around your art that extends beyond your work itself. I mean, you know, so much of what you talk about Lovecraftian aesthetic. I mean, my introduction to the Lovecraftian aesthetic was the movie Alien, directed by Ridley Scott, and it was the sets and the look of that film are hugely influenced by the stuff that Lovecraft described in his early stories. And I didn't know that as a child watching it, but when I loved that movie. I read reviews of it later. I talked to people who were interested in it, and that leads you back, and that kind of pop culture trail of influence stuff really starts with Lovecraft, with the collaborators that Salas was just talking about, and the kind of ideas they were working on together.
And so, as he thought of it, he called his body of work and the gods the Yog Sothothery, which it was based on his main god, or one of his main gods, Yog Sothoth. And later, his successor, Derleth, renamed it the Cthulhu Mythos, because I think just Cthulhu became the most popular character, and so they identified with it. But it was really the invention of the idea of a shared universe, where he could borrow his friends' characters and incorporate them, and his friends themselves as fictional characters within it. And then they would do the same. So there's more stories. These are all in the public domain because they wanted it to be more than it just has run out of the copyright.
Yeah, I mean, he brings up a great point with the shared universe concept that you can't possibly overstate Lovecraft's influence on comics, and his peers, people like Robert Howard who worked on Conan, their influence on comics is enormous. And part of it, of course, is just the tone and imagery of stories like that, but another part is this sense of a shared universe where characters and themes and ideas are going to pop up together, and the sense that that's what you're looking for. I mean, that when you come to Lovecraft, or when you come to Conan, or when you come to comics, what you're looking for is a sense of continuity and a sense of a larger plan and that ambition. And the idea that this would be the driving force that brings you to a work, that was something really new in fiction. And something that I think, to get back to what we were saying earlier, is inextricable from the Industrial Revolution, from developments in mass media, from huge immigration waves in across North America that obviously Lovecraft responded negatively to, but his fiction almost reflects the power of it. And then the way he wrote his fiction almost reflects the power of these kind of changes in how media and structure in society were being structured.
So to gather the themes of the mythos, the idea that Earth is insignificant. We are insignificant. The beings that create the universe, that actually exist within the universe, these cosmic gods, they're gods to us at least. They're just beings that really have a reason beyond what we can understand. And to even just glimpse it would drive us mad. And in those few times when we have, as a species, glimpsed these little bits that we could take of these gods, they inspired whole religions and sorcery and all kinds of blood magic. So it is the backbone to all the mystical experiences that have happened throughout human history and have shaped human history just by appearing. And in some ways, Earth, because they were just discovering the wider universe at the time, Earth is the center of it all, even though it's insignificant, which is sort of a paradox. But it's the place, kind of like a prison or something, where some of these great old ones might go to be in prison. It doesn't make sense, of course, but these beings just happen to hop around and eventually will visit Earth.
Yeah, it's a sense of the dreadful sublime that everything we've accomplished has brought us to just a glimpse of something greater, and now it's going to annihilate us. It's very much an antithesis to Enlightenment philosophy. It's a sense that Enlightenment philosophy has somehow failed, that it's curdled, that our belief in individual self-improvement and the search for knowledge, that this will better humanity, has actually brought us up short, and that we're going to find something we can't understand and can't reckon with in terms of rationality. Ironically, though, as we say, there's lots of fraught contradictions with Lovecraft. It very much uses the tools of Enlightenment philosophy to reach that point. Lovecraft experiments with metafiction and intense character biography and just a general belief in interrogating religious precepts and the basic concepts of our knowledge. And he works very much within that tradition. But the conclusions he draws are that the belief in individual worth unrestrained to solve humanity's problems is folly, and that when we find out the truth of what the universe and existence is, it's going to be very much what our ancestors thought it was, which is nasty, short, brutish, and horrifying. And that you don't get that tension without the search for knowledge first. And I think that's an interesting what makes Lovecraft so key to modern fiction is that tension.
So we can't talk about him without talking about the racism that permeates throughout his stories. Sometimes it's shocking. Sometimes it's representative of the time, and yet that's never an excuse, because he also was just an incredibly racist person. There's some of the phrases he's using, some of the ways he viewed other cultures. It's shocking, I would say, to us today.
Oh yeah, and it has to be brought up not only because it's horrifying in and of itself, but because it was clearly what was driving his fiction. I mean, when he talks about the repulsion and the intense dread he feels at these beasts and these gods he's describing, it's explicit. You can see with his correspondence and how he framed his stories that what he was drawing on was his repulsion for Jewish people and black people and anyone who wasn't pretty much exactly like him. And that's something you have to reckon with if you love his stuff. That not only the author, but the emotion he draws from is what's inspiring the power of his fiction. That's really difficult to deal with. It's in some ways reminds me of Rorschach from Watchmen, where you're compelled by his character, but you realize that the drama driving him is his intense loathing for pretty much every human being on the face of the planet. It's difficult to swallow. I mean, and to tie this into A Song of Ice and Fire, part of how I think you make Lovecraftian influenced fiction work is you bring that to the surface and deal with it. I mean, no one in A Song of Ice and Fire is more tied to Lovecraftian imagery and themes than the Ironborn. And the driving theme of the Ironborn in A Song of Ice and Fire is this supremacist mindset that has just destroyed their society, that has driven them to fight these ridiculous wars to inflict, horrible damage on their neighbors. And instead of, digging down and investing in trade, this Lovecraftian mindset that they have has wrecked their society. And I think Martin does a really terrific job of tying that into the imagery surrounding characters like Euron, that you have these characters who are carrying out a Lovecraft story in which Lovecraft's ideas are shown to be foolish. And I think that's exactly the kind of balance you want to strike writing Lovecraftian fiction in the 21st century.
So to highlight one of his major stories, A Haunter of the Dark, and this one does play directly into A Song of Ice and Fire. First off, he started off with Robert Bloch and transformed his friend into Robert Blake as the main character, who is just hearing these weird rumors about a church that turns out to be the Church of Starry Wisdom that's in this small town in New England. And the goings on there that occur become obviously supernatural. And he is kind of writing the story, the main character, as he's experiencing these horrors. And he ends up opening up sort of a dimensional portal to allow an aspect of Nyarlathotep, the Haunter of the Dark, to escape and to bring terror to the world.
It's a terrific story, and it's interesting that you mentioned earlier Robert Bloch, of course, wrote Psycho, and that Psycho doesn't appear to be Lovecraftian fiction on the surface. It's and takes place in very mundane settings among people with interesting but very mundane problems. But the sense in Psycho when the initial protagonist is killed off suddenly, and you get the sense of just the rules of the universe falling away, and you don't know what the story is going to be anymore. That mood is very Lovecraftian. That sense that the world is suddenly ruled by forces you don't understand. I think you see that really as a theme in stories like this, and in stories that are drawn from stories like this.
And I should also mention, because it's important, the Shining Trapezohedron is this black, weird, irregularly shaped stone that fell from the sky. Apparently it was created by these alien beings who live on Pluto or Saturn, and they sent it to Earth to mess with us.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's definitely, Nyarlathotep comes up many, many times because he has so many aspects, and he's the one god who really communicates with humans, and more than anything, wants to see humans drive themselves to destruction, and he gives them the tools to do it. So it's kind of hard to see, but through the expansion of the mythos after his death, especially, August Derlath, that I'll talk about in a second, took over and sort of formalized the mythos. And Derlath was a Christian, and so he had views of good and evil, elemental forces that really are still controversial in the way that they shaped his formalization of the mythos. As you can see here, there's lots of different gods included. And this is just a small snippet with the outer gods at the top, the cosmic beings who basically dreamt up the universe and allow it to exist. As we'll talk about in a second, at the center of the universe is this more or less nucleus that's just alive, but doesn't even know it. Doesn't even know that it's dreamt up the universe. And so all the other gods sit around piping to it to keep it asleep, because if it wakes up, everything stops.
Yeah, which is a pretty dark and grim vision of the universe. Yeah. But it's also, I think it is interesting that you have a Christian author taking over large portions of it, because there is an element of Old Testament dread in Lovecraftian fiction that I think survives all the kind of weirder, newer ideas, which does, again, filter down to A Song of Ice and Fire. If you look at Team Dragonstone, you have Melisandre bringing these kind of religious concepts and ideas that, on the one hand, draw from kind of more mystical concepts that comes up in Lovecraftian fiction, but Stannis himself is also very much kind of an Old Testament, biblical, come to punish you for your sins kind of figure. So I think you see that mix of Christian symbolism and Lovecraftian ideas filter down to the series for sure.
That's an interesting point. And it's still debated today. As you see this, S.T. Joshi here, one of the authors inspired, is sort of the greatest biographer of Lovecraft, and is an interesting case because he's Indian born, but he has to wrestle with the racism of it. But he's one of his biggest proponents, and he really does not like Durlath. So there's still a lot of debates over how it was formalized. So to go through a few of the gods within the Outer God Pantheon, Azathoth was created by Lovecraft. He's, in essence, just kind of a floating being made of atomic nuclei that is everything, in essence. And he's an idiot god in the sense that he's unthinking, and he doesn't even he or she, whatever it is, doesn't even acknowledge that it has dreamt up the universe, that everything depends on its being asleep and dreaming. And so it just sits there surrounded by the other gods who take turns just playing pipe music to keep it from waking up.
Yeah, and that sense of the center of all creation and magic and everything being a almost narcotic, passive sort of being is something you see in the Song of Ice and Fire. You see it in the House of the Undying, where at the core of all this magic and prophecy are incredibly old mummies just sitting still, staring at each other across the table. You see it in the North, where the three-eyed crow, Bloodraven, is not this, active wizard jumping across the landscape, casting spells with his wand, but someone who is just plugged in and sits perfectly still, staring straight ahead. And everything he gets involved with is very much at the mental level. So it's that, again, that great kind of tension between this ultimate power and yet this weird passivity that is supposed to make you kind of cynical about that ultimate power. It's not even being done by creatures who want to rule you. It's just being dreamt up. That's all your existence is.
Yeah. Nyarlathotep, just probably pronouncing it wrong. How would you say it?
You got it better than me. I think we're supposed to stumble over these, really.
Yeah, and that's the one thing, these are alien beings that may have pronunciations that we can't handle, so just let it slide off. Nobody should worry about pronouncing it right. But Nyarlathotep is the one who's the most personal. He visits Earth often and has thousands of forms and has avatars that he uses to seduce men into power, to make them think that they're great, and then ultimately leading to their destruction and maybe the destruction of everyone around them. He may have given the scientists the tools to the nuclear bomb, that kind of idea. That he is the harbinger of death. He is many-formed, just creeping, crawling evil, but he's not going to kill you directly. He's going to make you do it yourself.
Yeah, he wants to take advantage of your weakness and prove you deserve it before you die. It's almost like a cynical take on Prometheus, where he brings the fire to humanity, but it's not for advancement, it's not for enlightenment, it's for our own destruction.
And then Yog-Sothoth, as it says there, he knows the gate. He is the gate. He's the key and the guardian of the gate. Past, present, future, all are one in Yog-Sothoth. Somehow this being is coterminous with all time and space, knows everything that's happening, and yet is locked out of our universe in another dimension that can be accessed through these gates. Think about like the Werewood Gate or something like that, where all of a sudden you go through and you're granted knowledge at a cost, of course, probably blood.
Exactly, like the House of the Undying, or
Yeah.
Or a classic example of how Lovecraft has influenced pop culture is Ghostbusters. I mean, you have the central enemy and threat of Ghostbusters is soaked in Lovecraftian fiction. You have someone guards the gate and someone has the key, and you have this weird pyramid beyond the dimensions of the strange being that comes out, and that's all happening within the context of an Animal House influenced weird goofy 80s comedy. But that's how strong Lovecraftian influence was, that you could have a guy like Dan Aykroyd, who was, went through SNL in that comedy world, but he read stuff like Lovecraft and paranormal fiction that got in his head so strong that he had to have that in this movie, and they had to cut it back so far from his initial insane ideas for that movie. But that's, in the period in the 70s and 80s, more than anyone else, the images and characters like this really came through and were part of, hugely selling, high-grossing movies. So it started off as kind of this weird cult thing, but developed so strongly.
Another one is Shub-Niggurath, the Black Goat of 1,000 Young, who is pretty much directly referenced in Song of Ice and Fire, the main god of Qohor, there who, the idea being that if you go into a deep forest and you sacrifice an animal or worse, a human, she will appear, and she's sort of the evil mother being. Evil's the wrong term, because these guys aren't evil. They just
Dreadful.
they're dreadful. They appear evil to us. Their actions are unexplainable to us. But through sacrifice, you can birth these ungodly beings. And some claim that she may be the root of all life on earth. There's others that say it's Ubosaha. Anyway, another god. But point being, that's your mother.
Soak it in.
Hi, Mom.
And then this one is an interesting one, created by Ramsey Campbell, who's a good friend of George R. R. Martin's and a horror writer in his own right, who worked with August Derleth a lot in the waning days of his life, of Arkham House. So he wrote a lot of Cthulhu Mythos stories initially, and then developed his own style. And one of his creations was Groth, the Harbinger, who somehow is this red comet-looking thing that goes by and awakens magic and sleeping great old ones on planets. And he's also described as a rusty moon. It's got an eye, but it closes the eye as it goes by. It sings this song, the music of the spheres, as it goes through space. And any old ones that happen to be sleeping on the planet are awoken to that planet's doom.
Yeah, that sense of a kind of a herald of the doom, I think, is something that filters down to a song of Ice and Fire for sure. And the image, of course, of comets and moons, as we see with the Dothraki origin of dragons, is something that was almost a direct one-to-one lift.
Yeah, and this may or may not be the influence, but it's interesting to see that this kind of character exists in the well that George is borrowing from. And then the next level down, in essence, is the great old ones. And again, this isn't something Lovecraft did. This is more Derleth's work in describing these cosmic beings versus the more humanistic, or just beings that have a physical presence, I guess, in essence, that aren't everywhere all at once. But they hop from planet to planet, and when they do, they cause a lot of destruction. So we'll start with everybody's favorite, Cthulhu.
What?
Yeah. Why vote for a lesser evil? He is theorized to be sleeping in the Pacific, the South Pacific, in the sunken continent of Lemuria, in a city called Relay, and he was put to sleep, in essence, after a giant battle with the weak elder gods of Earth, who somehow conspired to get him to pass out. And yet, even in his sleep, his dreams are sending out these psychological waves that influence probably all of you guys, like artists and people with tendencies towards beauty and love and whatnot, creative people, I guess you would say. When at times of weakness, his influences can come through.
Yeah, I mean, and Cthulhu is a classic example of Lovecraft's influence on pop fiction. There's, art of Cthulhu in a Santa costume. You can buy little models of him, little posters of him. There's gifts of him. He's one of the first big horror characters that kind of has endured beyond the creation of its author. And there's also that great sense that Sas was talking about, where his influence is the source of not just madness, but our creativity and our art and the best in us as well, in the sense that these are two sides of the same coin, and it's perilous to meddle with these things is a huge theme in Lovecraft.
And then one of the few actually created by Derleth is Cthugha, which is a giant ball of flame, in essence. He really just wanted a flame god. He was trying to go elemental with his gods, and he had a couple other ones, and so he created Cthugha, who is, in one of his stories, is called into a swamp in Wisconsin. Derleth being from Wisconsin, he said his stories there, to fight a regional Nyarlathotep who happened to show up and was bugging everybody. So it's a silly story in some ways, but I highlight him as one of the interesting potential influences on the Lord of Light, something like that. But also just one of the few that Derleth actually did, instead of just taking all of Lovecraft's ideas.
If you've seen The Fifth Element, the expanding ball of flame and eternal evil, that's the essential antagonist in this movie, is probably more or less drawn from this.
And then another friend of George's, Lynn Carter, who was, he was really operating in the 60s and 70s, wrote a lot of the revival Conan stories, working with some other editors, working with Durlap, and had his own sword and sorcery series, Thongor, a couple of, that's lesser known, kind of fun, kind of cheesy stuff. But he wanted to create something. So the progeny of Cthulhu is Efun Zaha, the icy flame, that is this gray flame that exists somewhere in the North Pole and was released at one point, and that's why the North Pole is frozen. His power is to just all of a sudden freeze everything, makes him very, very powerful. Again, a later addition to the mythos.
Oh, certainly, but that same sense of dreadful sublime in winter is
Yeah.
something you can see in the Song of Ice and Fire
Yeah.
with the others, of course.
And seeing that there's a relationship between fire and ice.
Oh, yeah.
It's like direct, and it's not just ice, it's the cold flame.
Sure,
It's
that
the
dialectic
cold
process,
burns just
yeah.
as well as flame does.
Right, there's that great Jojen Reed quote from Brand's second chapter in The Storm of Swords, which is just basically that you
Yeah.
know, the land is one, ice and fire can mate, all that good stuff.
Love that
Mm-hmm.
quote. Bolkrog, he's lesser known, but he's one of the earlier characters. But what you do see is in the story of the Doom of Sarnath, he ends up destroying the city, and then Sarnath is directly incorporated into some of the Essos empires, the Sarnor, and there's actually a city of Sarnath. And then Ib is also from this story as well. Hastur is interesting because you see it in True Detective, right?
Yes.
True Detective is the Yellow King, the Yellow Sign, this idea of this mystical cult that's behind every bad thing that's happening in a small town. And all they have to do is show you this symbol, and all of a sudden your brain is kind of locked in and you're a part of the cult. He's this, he actually appears through a play that is part of a fictional play that's part of a book. It's never fully described, other than that anybody who reads the play ends up going insane and becoming a cult member. So but he started, interestingly enough, as a literary character as a shepherd god, Hastur the shepherd god. And so if you want, and then he became the Yellow King through this correlation with the play, The Yellow King. And you see his symbolism throughout the description of the Yeti emperors, like the 69th Yellow Emperor is very, very similar to him. I had another thought. I'll think of it when you talk.
Sure, yeah, True Detective is another great example of Lovecraft's influence on pop fiction, the imagery and kind of dreadful, sublime themes that go in the first season of that show especially. Of course, True Detective, its first season was often compared to David Lynch, and that's another great example of how Lovecraftian themes have influenced a lot of Americana pulp fiction. And Lynch is someone who has kind of mined the rich vein of intersections between Lovecraftian themes and noir fiction or Americana stories, and realize that you can have an intense charge of setting up this environment that seems pure and wholesome, and then introducing Lovecraftian imagery and themes into it is a great way to get a reaction out of your audience. Twin Peaks is probably the best example of that. You set up this seemingly perfectly wholesome Americana town and reveal that the underbelly is not just crime and sin, but this intense, weird war between monsters of different elemental powers. That contrast is something that I think is the best influence that's come out of Lovecraft. Is like, let's take Lovecraft and put it on another genre. Let's take this genre and Lovecraft it. That's something that works so effectively over and over again.
Because that fear is sort of universal, no matter the overlying theme. Yeah. Oh, what I was going to say is that the Valyrians used to worship a shepherd god. You realize when they were shepherds, and then it's a shepherd who appears one-armed, who all of a sudden makes everybody storm the dragon pit and just kill all the dragons. So this theme, this idea of the horror of Hastur is throughout the books. Tsathoggua is a creation of Clark Ashton Smith, and he is probably the statue that's on the Isle of Toads.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because he's like a half sloth, half frog, kind of hairy, weird-looking monkey. There's lots of different ways that he's drawn, but and also Clark described him very differently than Lovecraft did when he used him as well.
That's true.
So. And then Atlach Nacha and Yig. Yig is also in the Conan world known as Set, or at least an influence on Set, the serpent god. So these, we have the spider god with a human-like face. We have a serpent god who's actually kind of humanoid in some ways as well. And then it's mentioned throughout the, in one portion of the World of Ice and Fire, that there was a battle between worshippers of a serpent god and a spider god who fled the city of Liber after these great battles. So that's probably there as well. And then, of course, the Deep Ones, who are not a god, they're a race of intelligent, ocean-dwelling beings who have interacted with humans for generations. And in fact, they're directly called out in the World of Ice and Fire as probable ancestors of the Iron Man.
Yep. This is where you really get into the sense that the World of Ice and Fire is beneath the surface of the Lovecraft universe, and that's what's behind a lot of the races and artifacts and everything that's kind of the historical baseline for this planet. World of Ice and Fire is pretty much explicit about that especially in the kind of southwestern part of Westeros, these are the guys behind pretty much everything.
Yeah, and the Squishers too.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what they're describing.
That's a classic example.
Is one of these guys.
Just like how these Snarks and Grumpkins became, the others became the Snarks and Grumpkins, filtered through legend and time, the Deep Ones became the Squishers.
Yeah, and it's interesting to note that the Squishers appear near the Vale, where the Royces have these runes etched in their metal, in the bronze, and it's these runes that are used to defeat Deep Ones, these, according to Lovecraft. Of course, this isn't real. But
important to note these things.
Yeah, I know. But again, you could get it tattooed now. Yeah. So they also worship Cthulhu, but their main gods or leaders are Father Dagon and Mother Hydra, who actually are just giant Deep Ones because they never stop growing and they never stop living unless they're explicitly killed, which makes a lot of them into like scholars. They end up reading a lot of books and just thinking about stuff for a long time. There's other Mythos characters that are important, that are incorporated, like Nodens is taken from Celtic myth. The Vormies are pretty ugly in their depiction, but you could kind of relate them to the Children of the Forest or something, and then there's like the giants. The Migo are the things that created the Shining Trapezohedron. They're these weird beasts that came to Earth at some point and built all these giant black stone cities, and then left because of a war they had with the fungi from Yoggoth, of course. Yes. And then, surprisingly, the Bran Macmorn, King Cole, and Conan, which are Robert E. Howard's kind of contributions to the mythos. Bran, that name Bran, it means raven, as you know probably at this point in Welsh, and he took it as like he was the king of the Picts, which at that time they were sort of rediscovering the Picts, and they were kind of seeing them as noble savages, as somewhat like akin to the Native Americans, this proud race of northern barbarians who held off the Romans for generations as they were invading.
Yeah, that sense of the connection between natural imagery and king imagery is something you see in, of course, Arthurian fiction, something you see in a lot of fairy tales, it's something you see in Lovecraft, and that influence on Bran is really strong.
So there's also a lot of places that are mentioned throughout Lovecraft. Here's a couple of them. I won't dwell on this. I mentioned it. And then he died in 37, around 46 years old, kind of broke at that time, and still relatively unknown. And Durlath was there, if you can go to the next one, let's talk about his legacy. It was unique, in essence, to be able to have, to question God at 6 or 5 or whatever he did and say, well, that's just like Santa Claus, come on. And to create a whole other mythos is his lasting legacy more than anything. But also the themes that Emma keeps describing, they filter throughout pop culture today. Did you want to say something?
Oh, good, keep going.
Yeah. To continue him, one of his writing friends, Durlath there, basically took all his unfinished stuff and his finished stuff and just started putting it out in a special publishing house called Arkham House that he claims never really made any money. It was sort of a labor of love. he's gotten some criticism, as I mentioned, for his formalization of Lovecraft's ideas, but he also, for 20 years, when no one else knew about him, was pushing this stuff.
Yeah, and you see the same kind of thing with Tolkien, with Frank Herbert, with any kind of legacy of genre writing now. This really was the first kind of dispute and debate over that kind of the sense that genre fiction is IP. You know, it's an estate. It's something you have to shepherd, and it's powerful, and you have to take care of it.
These are on the page. Since we're running out of time, let's skip them. But George, you know, he grew up reading his first book, a fantasy book he ever bought, was edited by L. Sprague de Camp, who's on the page here, and written by Lynn Carter, who 15 years later, became his own editor as well. So and those guys were working with Durlath, who was friends with Lovecraft. Like, this is a very close relationship here. And so not only is he a fan, he's directly interacting with the influence, with the legacy itself. There's all kinds of influences throughout it. We'll go through a few of them in the time we have left, including a lot of the characters inspired. As I've mentioned most of these. You know, you see it in the people of the Thousand Islands who have sort of a green tinge and are afraid of the sea. The weird-looking people on the Isle of Toads who worship the Sagwa statue. Like, it's all throughout. You know, you see probably Hastur. You definitely see Shub-Niggurath, the drowned god, has a lot of connections to Cthulhu, and that's everybody's recognized that at this point.
Oh yeah, The Forsaken pretty much made that explicit. If you haven't read the Euron Greyjoy Winter Chapter, not too much spoilers to say. It makes those associations very, very blatant.
Yeah. And then here's a bunch of the places that I mentioned. You know, Lang especially is a really well-known Lovecraftian sort of pseudo place that exists in a dimension, and then he's explicitly put it here as a big island with a lot of weird things that are happening underground that you don't want to experience, and only the Langi are able to hang out there for a while. So it's something going on there. I like to think about the 3 Valyrian colonies founded by religious dissidents, okay? Which means that they didn't believe that there were all these gods available for worship. They only wanted to worship a few. One of them, Qohor, is like explicitly from Lovecraft. The other 2 could be, because of how they're described. Like Lorath, they worship the blind god, which relates a lot to Azathoth, the blind idiot god. You know, it's just right there. And then Norvos, I think that they worship the true god. That might be Hastur. That might be like the original shepherd god that the Valyrians, and these are probably non-dragon riding Valyrians, you know, who's found because they didn't have dragons. So they probably were like, damn those guys, all right, we're gonna go do our own thing. So it's pretty clear that there's some relationship with those cities and these gods I've described. And then obviously the Iron Men, like this is the number 1.
Oh yeah, this is really the touchstone of Lovecraft's influence on A Song of Ice and Fire. Euron Greyjoy is basically, if you filtered Lovecraft through the fiction that George R. R. Martin was reading when he was an impressionable teenager in his early 20s, if you filter Lovecraft's dreadful sublime through Thomas Pynchon and Kurt Vonnegut and the kind of 60s, 70s psychedelic fiction, what you get is Euron Greyjoy. That's that sense of the world ending to these forces you don't understand and the foolish men who try to master them. Like, all the imagery around Euron is that. And it's something exhilarating to see kind of updated and filtered.
Plus, they have a guy named Dagon, right?
Who has fish eyes. It's very blatant. Yeah.
And then this is the only other one that's just as blatant, is the Bloodstone Emperor.
Yes.
You know, and this is our last slide.